Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have a chance to share a little bit about how I can be so deeply pessimistic about our political system, but so optimistic about the future of our nation. I have absolutely no doubt, and I hope that I can move some of you in this direction, that America's best days are still to come. It's not something we read about in the history books or that we have nostalgic feelings for. I appreciate Greg's introduction and the chance to be a part of the academic community here at King's. Really excited to work with Boyd and Greg and others on this Institute for Community-Driven Solutions. And I'm just looking forward to seeing where it all unfolds. Boyd mentioned the two books. One was called In Search of Self-Governance. I wrote that back in 2009. The other book is coming out next year. And these are important milestones, markers in my life. You know, we all need to have markers and reference points for where we've been to help us understand where we're going. When I wrote the book back in 2009, I was where tens of millions of people are today, really depressed about our political system, and I didn't know where to turn. And I was struggling with that. In fact, what was really difficult is that I would go out and speak around the country or talk about polls or candidates or issues or whatever it might be, and there was always somebody in the audience who asked a question that I could not answer, and it broke my heart that I couldn't answer it. And the question took different forms, but it was always, what can I do? What can I do to help the political process? What can I do to make our country better? Sometimes people would say, you know, do we need term limits? Is that the one thing that we should push for? Sometimes it was, should we elect more people from our team? But it was always, what can I do? And by 2009, I had spent enough time seeing the way the political system worked that I couldn't give them an answer, because truthfully, there was nothing they could do. There was nothing through the political process, because the process was designed to keep people out. A lot of people I dealt with in the political world were saying, you know, if voters would get more involved, if they wouldn't be so apathetic, well, the world would be better. They should read all those lengthy, boring position papers that we write, and then we would be better off. But it wasn't apathy among voters. Voters are looking for a way to get involved, and there wasn't something to do. And for me, this was really a tough time, because I grew up believing in our nation's founding ideals. I want us to be a government of by-and, or to have a government of by and for the people, but it wasn't working. The system was broken. And I realized that I had lost faith in that political process. And this is not something to celebrate. I felt a little bit, I think, like Dorothy must have in The Wizard of Oz. You know, she invested all this hope in this wizard who would get her back to Kansas and who would solve all the problems of her friends. And then Toto pulls back the curtain and she finds out he was just a man and it was all fraud. That's where we were with the political process. Now, I wrote that in 2009, and I knew I still had hope. I was looking for where to be hopeful. And the reason this became such a great marker in my life is about 3 months later, there was a life-changing event that totally reshaped my worldview. And it's really good to have, I guess, a marker of how far down I was before things started to look up. And ironically, the life-changing event that made me more optimistic was one of the worst days of my entire life. It was the morning of March 13th, 2010. About 5 in the morning, we heard some noise outside, and my wife jumped up and peeked out the curtain, and I heard some noise, but pretty soon saw the flashing lights reflecting the police were coming, and I was thinking, it's probably just some drunk kids out there. Police will take care of it. I can roll over and go back to sleep. It's a Saturday morning. I don't need to be up at this time. But instead, there was a loud and urgent knock on the door. And my wife was already up, and so she went peeling downstairs to see who was at the door. And I was thinking, that's really stupid. We don't know who this is. It's 5 in the morning. So I just yelled out, if they're not wearing a uniform, do not open the door. But it was a police officer. And what he said was, the Manchester Hotel is engulfed in flame. Now, I live in a really small town at the beach. The houses are about 6 feet apart, and the Manchester Hotel wrapped around our house. He said, the Manchester is engulfed in flame. You have to be prepared to evacuate. And I could take you through the next 45 minutes of my life, moment by moment. I remember everything. And I remember it almost like the Matrix movie, that slow motion part as you were going through it. But I'll spare you all of that and just let you know that 45 minutes after he knocked on our door, our house was gone. I don't mean it was charred and scarred. I mean the appliances melted, the bikes melted, everything physical, all the stuff that we had accumulated in more than 20 years of marriage was gone. There were no wedding gifts, no pictures, nothing left. The fire took out our house, a hotel, a B&B, and 5 other houses. 200 volunteer firemen contained the damage, or it would have been much worse. We were thankful that nobody was hurt, but I got to tell you, that there's just a shock. My wife cried on the 13th of every month for a full year as we remembered that. I was in such shock that I just kept going through the motions. I had a TV interview that afternoon, so I went on TV. I had a speech the next day, so I went and gave the speech. But we were just going through the motions. It took us 20 months before we could rebuild the house and move back in. And during that time, my faith obviously helped get me through it, but so did my community. One of the things that I learned during this experience was how much people want to help. We had so much support. Some was from people in our church. Some was from people in our neighborhood who didn't go to church. Some was from people I'd never met before. Sometimes it was an insurance adjuster. Sometimes it was a local committee official, a local township person. They were offering us food and shelter and entertainment and clothing. And it finally got to the point where we had to say, enough. The people in Haiti need your help. We don't. We have good insurance. We're going to be okay. But I was told we couldn't turn them away because a lot of people had been on the fringe of the fire, and they were so thankful that they didn't lose their home. They still wanted to help. We had to let them grieve too. And when you go through an experience like that, it just makes you appreciate things differently. Now, I'd like to tell you that I don't care about stuff anymore, but I still do. Maybe not as much as I did before. It doesn't radically alter that much. But it makes you take a look at the world differently. I had grown up, I've always been around volunteer activity. I've always been in groups like that where you help your neighbors, but I never recognized the power of it. Somewhere during this experience, and I can't remember exactly where it fit or what triggered it, but I read about a sociology experiment, and maybe some of you have heard of this too, but a 1-minute film was produced, and it showed 6 people walking in a circle. And they had jerseys on to identify that they were on 2 different teams, and they were passing basketballs back and forth. Sometimes they were bounce passes, sometimes chest passes, sometimes they'd lob them up a little bit. And test subjects were brought in to watch this video for 1 minute and count the number of times that one team passed the ball. And I think the answer was 36. So they're kind of intense. You 36 passes in 60 seconds, people are focusing, making sure it's the right team and not the other guys. And what happened in the middle of the film, for 9 seconds, a student dressed as a gorilla walked into the center of the screen, did the big gorilla thing, and half the people who saw it never saw the gorilla. They were so focused and counting the number of passes that they missed something because they didn't expect to see it. In America today, when we get so obsessed with all the details of the political process and the electoral college paths to victory and what demographics there are, we're missing invisible gorillas all around us. And that's what I began to see as I saw the power of community working after that fire. All of a sudden, instead of looking at the world and saying, oh my gosh, as Boyd said, we're divided, we're polarized, we have all these problems, and this group doesn't like this group, I actually began to look and see that in America there is something that unifies us. I can't say it as well as some people, but there is what I guess you would call it the American creed. And it's a core belief that we should all be able to decide what to do with our own life, so long as we don't interfere with the rights of others to do the same. It's a basic idea of freedom. Now, we may all choose different ways to live our life. We may make different choices, but the core belief that unites Americans is that idea that we should have the right to make those choices. And on top of it, there's something else. A lot of times, people who talk about freedom forget this second half, and you can't. The second half is most of us don't use that freedom to be rugged individualists and go hide in the mountains and not talk to anybody else. We are social beings. We want to use our freedom to work together in community, to live together in the community, to make a better world together in community. And when you begin to look at things from that perspective and you see that common ground, everything starts to look different. There are 65 million people who do volunteer work in America right now. 65 million people who are giving of themselves and of their time to help others. And these are only the official ones. These are the people that register with a group to volunteer. There's all kinds of other activity that goes on. When a young mom brings a child home from the hospital, neighbors bring food and meals to help them get through that. That's on top of the 65 million. There are 22 million entrepreneurs. And some of them are big and famous tech entrepreneurs, but most of them are running small businesses in small towns because they're trying to find pragmatic solutions and make a service available to their friends and neighbors. When you begin to see things in this perspective, you realize what you missed with all those invisible gorillas. Government, politics is a part of the solution. It's not that it's unimportant. You should certainly go vote, even if you think it's just for the lesser of two evils. It's part of what the process is. But governing is much more than government alone. Every institution, every relationship in society has a role in making our society work. If you are married, your spouse plays a role in governing your life. If you go to a school, that has an impact on governing your life. If you have a job, that has an impact on it. Every institution has this role to play. What we need is an all-hands-on-board approach that draws on all of these resources to make our country work a little better. Well, when you start looking like that, you then watch the news, and something seems a little out of sync, a little bit of a disconnect, because the message that comes from political news in particular, and from all those people out of Washington, is politics is all that matters. Politics is the way we set the nation's course. Your job is to vote for whichever team you want to win and then let them set the agenda on how to move the nation forward. The reality is exactly the opposite. In the real world, the culture leads and the politicians lag behind. We all say that, but we don't think about what it really means all that often. The culture leads and politicians lag behind. I went back as part of the research on my new book and read through the headlines from the 1970s. That's when I was going from my teenage years into my young adulthood. And all the headlines and the names, I remembered them, but they all seem pretty irrelevant today. Nothing seemed to connect, and there was something missing from all those stories. There were two guys who dropped out of college and started a couple of businesses in their garage, and they weren't in any of the headlines in the 70s. But Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, when they founded Apple and Microsoft, did more to shape the world that we live in today than all 7 presidents who have been in office since then. 2 college dropouts, totally unknown in the 70s, have done more to shape our world than 7 consecutive presidents. Change always comes from outside the political process. The politicians lag behind. They do need to eventually confirm what has been done, but they are not the people who are deciding the direction for our nation. If you read one book this year, I guess one book other than ones that I'm working on, 3 books, mine 2 plus this one. There's a book called The End of Big. It was written by Nico Maley. He's now at Harvard. He first came to fame. He was the internet guru for Howard Dean's 2004 campaign. And he talks about the impact of this digital revolution, the things that Gates and Jobs started 40 years ago. And what he says is that radical connectivity, the ability of us all to communicate directly with each other via our smartphones, is toxic to traditional institutions. They cannot survive. The bureaucracies that were built up before the digital revolution cannot survive in this new era. I look at the 200 million smartphone owners in this country as the greatest force for change that we have ever seen. And once you begin to recognize this, and think about what it's done. You know, when I was a kid, there were print newspapers. You never see them anymore. When I was a kid, there were 3 television networks, and we couldn't record shows. We all watched the same thing at the exact same time, and we all talked about it the next day because there were no other options. It was a bizarre world. And thankfully, we're a long way removed from that. But now we're in a situation where people have different choices. And when I start talking to groups about the power of community problem solving, a lot of people say, yeah, that's good. I spend my time at the food bank, or I do this, or I do that. But that's not really going to solve the big problems. That's really not going to get to where we have to get to. We make a mistake if we think our job is to launch a citizens' crusade to topple the status quo. We don't have to do that. It's already happening. The digital technologies are reshaping things. Our job is to take advantage of the opportunities that are created by change. And then we need to make sure that we guide them in a manner that is consistent with our values, that is consistent with the ideals of freedom and self-governance and equality. And we really need to make sure that we work towards creating a nation that can truly someday be called a nation with liberty and justice for all. But we don't have to start the change. We just have to guide it. And that is a huge difference. We don't have to have the answer to every single issue. What we need to do is draw upon a tradition that people in power don't talk about very much. America has a long history, longer than our country has been around, of pragmatic community problem solving. And one of my favorite stories, and it's great to be here at a college talking about this, has to do with the illegal founding of Harvard University. Nobody talks about this, and I'm sure they don't like to talk about it up at Cambridge. But back in the 1630s, we had a bunch of colonists up in Massachusetts, and they had big hopes for their colony. They wanted to create a city on a hill. And so they knew if we're going to build this great city on a hill, we need a great university to educate and train people. And there was one little problem. In the 17th century, under British law, you were not allowed to form a school or any organization without a charter from the king. Now, if you remember your history, those colonists had fled England because of religious persecution. They knew if they went back and asked the king for a charter, he'd probably say, sure, you can have your school, but you have to teach the Anglican religion. You have to teach my faith. And they didn't want to do that. Now, they could have gotten involved in politics. They could have lobbied some folks back home to maybe elect a different member of parliament, or maybe they could have bribed a couple of the king's advisors, or maybe gone over to the court and begged him to let them teach one course in alternative theology a month or something of that sort. But they did something entirely different. They just forgot to ask. And they started a school. And they got a little bit of a break. I mean, they were far away, and then England got involved in a civil war, and kings lost their heads, so they really weren't worrying too much about Harvard. But during this time, Harvard began teaching and graduating students. By the time the kings got around to noticing it again, they'd been doing so for about a quarter of a century. And then the king was so upset with that and other things that he removed the entire charter from the Massachusetts colony. But you know what? Didn't make any difference. Harvard kept teaching people and graduating people. By the time of the American Revolution, there were 7 illegal colleges in the United States teaching people. There were also thousands and thousands of independent free associations in this country that hadn't bothered to ask for permission to be created. This was something new under the sun. And when people started doing these things, they began to find they had the power to govern their own lives. That was a big part of what made America stand out and be unique, be a different kind of country right from the start. And there were abolition societies, and there were societies for helping take care of the poor, and there were educational programs. Whenever there was a problem, people got together and did something about it. And that's what we need to do. Every one of us has different passions, different skills, different gifts, different talents. We have different things that motivate us. But if you see a problem, solve it. If something touches your heart and you have the ability to do something about it, do it. If something reaches out to you and you don't know what to do, get together with some friends and fix it. It is much more effective to do that than it is to say, let's get a lobbying campaign together and let's see what kind of bill we can pass in Congress. Because if you actually solve the problems before you, you will make community life better, you will drive the culture, and sooner or later, things will change on a grand scale. Now, I have to tell you that if you go about serving your neighbors, and if you go about problem solving like this, in America today, there will always be a bureaucrat or a regulator who will say you can't do that. You didn't ask permission, you didn't fill out the right forms, you didn't get the rules right. I'm not advocating that people just willy-nilly go out and break the law. There's a lot of space within the laws. Just bureaucrats sometimes don't think you should be able to do anything unless you ask their permission first. But if you believe, for example, if your heart is really set on helping inner city children get a better education, find a way to use the new technologies, the homeschooling laws or whatever other set of laws can work in your favor. Get together with some teachers and concerned parents and create a new school, a school that is appropriate for the 21st century instead of an outdated model that is failing so many today. Go out there and solve problems. What we're going to be talking about at the Institute for Community-Driven Solutions is a massive campaign of community problem solving. People doing what they can with what's in front of them. The problem of the regulators will always be there. Philip Hamburger, who's written a great book called Is Administrative Law Unlawful, talks about the fact that there's always going to be people like this who say, I think he described the problem as the recurring human lust for power. There will always be people who want to tell the rest of you what to do. And if you go at this with the idea of making a political statement or an act of civil disobedience, well, it's not going to work out very well. But if you go at it with the idea of serving your community, when the regulator comes and says you can't do something, the community will stand with you. We've seen it in a grand scale recently with Uber. Mayor de Blasio didn't think Uber should be allowed to work in New York City unless they played by his rules. But millions of Uber users had a different idea, and the mayor had to back down. We're seeing that happen more and more with this era of radical connectivity. We have opportunities to solve problems in ways they've never been solved before, and that will make some people nervous. But a good friend of mine who's a Navy chaplain, I guess offered me the best summary of why this can work. He said that no bureaucracy, no regulatory state, no set of rules will ever be more powerful than the simple guideline of love thy neighbor. If you are loving your neighbor and you are serving people and you are being creative and you are looking for ways to get things done, you will change one corner of the world. Now, sometimes we tend to look back at the traditions that we have in this country and we put some of these people on a pedestal and we say that nothing can ever change. I think we have to look more at the attitudes than some of the specifics. I'm talking about this attitude of problem solving right now. And I'm going to give you an example that will show both how powerful it can be, but also how corrupting the idea of power can be. Thomas Jefferson, after the Revolution, after we had won our independence from Great Britain, wrote that all of these independent associations, all of these free illegal organizations had played a great role in defeating the British and that we could not have survived, we could not have won the war without them. And remember, this is Thomas Jefferson who wrote about government deriving their only authority from the consent of the governed. He then said, but now that we have our government in place, I'm not sure that we should allow these organizations anymore. Once his team was in power, he saw it differently. And he wasn't the only one. There was a famous Supreme Court case that involved Dartmouth, where the government of New Hampshire was trying to do to Dartmouth what the king wanted to do to Harvard back before independence was won. People who are in power will always try to monopolize the use of power. What makes a country great is when we begin to draw upon all the resources and we have the freedom to find solutions on our own. That's what we need to be working for today. Now, if you try and come up with a simple way to wrap this up, I would say, the one question I couldn't answer a long time ago was, what can someone do? Well, I now have an answer to that, and we're going to be exploring that and working on it through this Institute for Community-Driven Solutions. On top of that, I'm totally confident that community problem solving, it'll be fueled by the digital revolution and inspired by the idealism of millennials, can overcome the dysfunction of our political system. We might not be able to make our political system work better, but we can make our society work better. And that's really all that matters. If you still believe that politics and government are the only way we can move society forward, I'd ask you to rethink that. I would ask you to lose faith in that narrow ideological vision and instead accept a more pragmatic approach, the all-hands-on-board approach that relies upon government and churches and businesses and every organization in a society. And if you do that and you begin to join us on this journey and look for community problem-solving solutions, all of a sudden the world will look a lot brighter. You can be sitting out with friends and you can be complaining with them about how stupid the political process is and how depressing this thing is, or how you go to Washington and nobody listens, or you elect these people and they forget where they came from. But if you're doing that, I would like you to say to your friends, it's okay. The politicians aren't really the answer. They don't lead the nation. The culture leads, the politicians lag behind, and the reason that you don't have to get so depressed about what you see in the political world is because even though politics has failed, America will not. Thank you very much.